good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Julia Feder, and I have the privilege of serving as the acting director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality and associate professor of religious studies and theology here at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. And I am delighted to welcome you to this webinar. Before introducing our guest, I'd like to take a moment to say a word about the center. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross and the college, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian tradition, as well as how individuals practice their faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. The format for our program this evening is threefold. First, author Professor Halteman will offer a brief presentation about his book, Hungry, Beautiful Animals, and then he and I will engage in some conversation about the text, and then finally we will open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. So please feel free to send in your questions and comments at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. Just by pressing the Q&A button located at the bottom of the screen. And as a tip, if you don't see the Q&A button, if you press more, sometimes that reveals the Q&A button. So now it is my privilege to introduce our guest today. Matthew C. Halteman is professor of philosophy at Calvin University and a fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. He is the author of Compassionate Eating as Care of Creation and co-editor of Philosophy Comes to Dinner, Arguments about the Ethics of Eating. As an author, teacher, and advocate, he explores how the choices we make around food can shape a more compassionate, sustainable, and joyful world. His new book, Hungry, Beautiful Animals, The Joyful Case for Going Vegan, is driven by deep commitments to human flourishing, animal freedom, food systems transformation, and communal cooperation to realize as much truth, beauty, and goodness as we collectively can. He also eats vegan desserts like they're going out of style, even though they're just now coming into style. So welcome, Dr. Halteman.
Well, thank you so very much, Julia. I feel like we've been having this conversation for years because you were one of the first people I talked to about this campaign I was going to try to pull off. And now here we are. I will say it's a thrill to be at St. Mary's. For those of you who may have thought, if you're affiliated with the St. Mary's community, that I look like your provost with a beard. That's because she's my sister. But I'd like to think that nepotism had nothing to do with this. You know, we've been working for years with the previous director and having now conversations with Julia. I'm really excited to share this work with you today. And I'm going to awkwardly try to share my screen here for a second, which might take the absent-minded philosophy professor just a minute to achieve. All right. And Julia, can you confirm for me that we've succeeded?
It looks perfect.
It looks perfect. Great. All right. Well, let's hope it stays that way. It's really good to be with you. Thanks so much again, Julia, for this exciting opportunity. And I'll say I love the format of a brief presentation. For philosophers, that can be tricky, but I really like the idea of leaving plenty of room for dialogue and questions. So I'll get right down to it without much throat clearing here. In talking about hungry, beautiful animals today, I want to start by emphasizing that this is not a work of academic philosophy. It's a work of narrative-driven creative nonfiction. And since we're making plenty of room for stories in this book, I always like to start by sharing how unlikely it is that I now advocate for going vegan as a strategy for pursuing a joyful life in a more abundant world. This is not something I saw coming. I may not be the world's least likely vegan, but the cards were still pretty well stacked against the prospect. My paternal grandfather was an egg farmer. My maternal grandfather was an herbicide chemist. My mom's cousin-in-law is the CEO of one of America's largest pork producers. You can imagine how popular I am at family reunions. I wasn't raised on the farm, but favorite activities with cousins included riding tractors and exploring chicken houses and playing freeze tag behind great grandpa's butcher shed. I can't claim genuine farm boy cred, and I know better than to try that, but I do owe my existence and my spiritual aspirations and many of my most cherished memories and experiences to good people in agriculture. And as a Mennonite kid raised in the American Midwest at church potluck tables brimming with meat and cheese, I've spent the lion's share of my life eating and loving lots of animal products. So I'm the steak-craving high school football captain who gorged with fellow linemen on mammoth porterhouses and uncountable infinities of fried shrimp every Thursday night before weekend games. And I'm the knucklehead who posed for photographs, much to my wife's chagrin, at my own wedding with a mouthful of short rib fangs. And I'm the proud amateur dessert chef who transfigured 2 pounds of mascarpone cheese and a dozen eggs and a small lake of brandy into the world's most decadent tiramisu on highly anticipated Italian feast nights during annual summer vacations. Worth the price of admission for the book alone. It's Appendix B, right? Taste and see, as the good book says. I'm also a professional philosopher with a strong skeptical streak. It's pretty difficult to convince me of anything without good arguments, and I've got some sharp tools at my disposal for avoiding conclusions I don't like. And so 2 decades ago, the curious convergence of my bulldog's love and my partner's appetite for culinary challenges and a fellow philosopher's constructive criticism conspired to change my life. When my philosopher friend informed me one fateful lunch that my French dip sandwich was morally incompatible with my cherished and supposedly well worked out views about humankind, other animals, and the environment, my response was aggressively to try to prove him wrong. I went so far as to work up an entire college course on food ethics in hopes of finding 10 knockdown, drag-out reasons that he should shut his bunny-kissing mouth so I could keep stuffing mine with fennel-rubbed pork loin. What I found instead, much to my shock and initially to my chagrin, was a compelling combination of empirical evidence, emotional education, and moral and spiritual arguments in strong favor of the conclusion that people of goodwill have every good reason to go vegan, or at least to eat many more plants and many fewer animal products to the greatest extent possible given their circumstances. Now, as you can imagine, a big problem I've faced in attempting to share this transformational epiphany with others is that people think I'm a meddling downer and a crashing drag. And that's because trying to tell people what to eat, especially when that advice is served with a heaping side of guilt about the world going to hell in a handbasket thanks to their brisket. I mean, this feels like an invasion of privacy and a chastening of individual personal preference. I mean, let's be honest, when vegans get down to the brass tacks of explaining what they're concerned about, things often devolve quickly into a litany of really depressing news. I mean, most people would rather skydive without a parachute than commit to a lifestyle so seemingly full of sadness and bereft of joy. Because going vegan is so often framed negatively in terms of what vegans can't do, people understandably find it hard to imagine it as anything but a lonely journey into judgmental, life-negating deprivation. I mean, vegans can't eat pepperoni pizza, and they can't wear snakeskin boots, and they can't visit cute baby pandas at the zoo, and they can't buy designer cockapoos. For heaven's sake, They can't even indulge a paltry morsel of Nana Mildred's warm chocolate chip cookies, even though she baked them from her deathbed, issuing an impassioned plea to partake with her final earthly breath, right? This is always what friends and family want to know. Would you eat it if, right? Vegans don't because they can't, and they can't because the world is terrible. Farmers are evil, designers are cruel, zoos, those are prisons, breeders are eugenicists, your Nana, she's a stone killer, and animals are a sea of nameless, faceless victims. Vegans are against all this darkness with nothing but steamed cauliflower, pleather shoes, and maladjusted shelter mongrels to console them. Why does anyone go in for this dreary lot? Sadly, this messaging strategy just isn't a winner for wooing creatures as complex and conflicted as human beings. I mean, we have physical needs and social hopes and emotional feelings and intellectual commitments and moral aspirations, which are rarely perfectly aligned. This is something that the Spirituality Center has often reminded us over the years, right? This body, mind, and spirit, it can be tough to bring alignment among these different parts of who we are. These interrelationships, I think, are especially fraught when it comes to our eating habits, as physical cravings and social expectations and emotional attachments to certain foods battle it out with our evolving intellectual and moral commitments that frankly increasingly cut deeply against the grain of our traditional culinary comforts. And I think we all know from experience that managing these inner conflicts can be brutal, right? Like when your gut wants a burger and your heart wants to nuzzle a cow and your head bobbles around between defending old habits so as not to kill the party and exploring new ones as your moral aspirations and climate anxiety sort of loom judgmentally over your diminishing self-respect, right? I mean, we've all been there for the inner family's upheaval. And as familiar as we are with these frustratingly complex inner dynamics, our attempts to inspire ourselves and others to change our eating habits and transform our food system are often curiously simplistic and even counterproductive. I mean, we allow the intellect to subject our physical, emotional, and social selves to endless fact-finding expeditions and abstract moral arguments and punishing forms of deprivation and discipline that don't resonate with our experience or desire. And we flood our inner systems with emotionally overwhelming horrors, the terrifying videos, the rigorous descriptions of suffering, and these predictably elicit defensive responses from our heads, even as they propagate deep moral shame and social anxiety and spiritual turpitude. But how might our cultural outlook on going vegan change if we envision it for once, in terms of what vegans are for rather than what they're against? What if we pivoted from obligation to opportunity, from the prevention of suffering to the promotion of flourishing, from abstention to desire? What if instead of understanding going vegan in terms of opposing things that are false, ugly, and bad, we envisioned it instead in terms of desiring and aspiring toward a world that is true, beautiful, and good? A world of deep kinship with members of other species that is grounded in scientific continuity, emotional coherence, and moral vision. A world in which the kinship we seek to cultivate with other creatures leads to a physically and emotionally more healthful existence for human beings too. A world in which our shared planet is more beautiful and fertile and long-lived home for all earthlings when we tread lightly and do not take more than we need. A world in which food for our fellow human beings is more accessible, nutritious, and abundant because the methods used to farm it are far more resource efficient and economically inclusive. A world committed to cultivating more inclusive and multidimensional consciousness, in which we realize that oppression of anyone who can flourish, regardless of their species, has a common root in our tendency to believe that might makes right, that we can animalize, instrumentalize, and consume anyone whose interests we deem lesser than our own. And last but certainly not least, the part I'm always waiting for with bated breath, a world of diverse, delicious, and welcoming cuisine wherein breaking bread together needn't mean sacrificing our cultural and communal favorites to take up an ascetic regime of steamed cauliflower and gelatinous raw tofu cubes, which is, I think, the public imagination, the raw tofu looms large. But vegan food is actually a dazzling cuisine that anyone can love and promote with or without aspiring to vegan living. So it's such a pity that vegan cuisine is often seen and treated as though it were for vegans only. I mean, but we don't act like this with any other delicious cuisine. I mean, imagine how odd it would be if a friend invited you out for Chinese or Indian or Ethiopian meal and you replied, no, no, no can do. Do I look Ethiopian to you? No, right? This is not how we do it. Vegan cuisine is delicious on its own terms, and everybody can enjoy the likes of crepes with fresh strawberries, coconut whipped cream, tofu banh mi sandwiches, and seitan sole on a roll with fresh spicy sesame coleslaw, and spicy mango salad, and curried cauliflower salad. Here's a crazy stuffed beet millet burger, which I admit probably has too much sodium, but worth it. Couldn't get my wedding ring off for a week, but, I recovered. Sweet potato fries. Here we have my famous seitan ribs. Not sure who's double fisting the booze here, so I'm going to quickly move on to hot wings here. We love our pizza, obviously. Nachos, of course. Taco Tuesdays, where everything from the crisper goes directly into a tortilla. Holy smokes, the Thai food and the Persian food and the cuisine of all cuisines, Ethiopian food. I mean, for heaven's sake, even the vegan cheese is getting amazing these days, which one could not say in honesty even 10 years ago. We've also got all the comfort foods, from the mac and cheese with greens to the beefy seitan stew to the biscuits and gravy and the party foods and the insane desserts like peanut butter fudge cheesecake. This was actually made by the provost of St. Mary's College. Credit where credit is due. Fresh coconut cream tart. Here is a quadruple decker grapefruit champagne cake. And of course, even a vegan creme brulee, with which I've been fooling omnivores for almost 2 decades. What this abundance of beautiful individual and communal benefits demonstrates is that going vegan can harmonize our physical, social, emotional, intellectual, and moral selves, enabling us to live toward the flourishing of the whole with each mindful meal. The hope is both to witness to the truth, beauty, and goodness of the world as it could be, and to strive for incremental progress in these directions through the daily disciplines of intentional eating, purchasing, and advocacy. Now, as we strive, I think it's crucial to remember, and the book is adamant about this, it's crucial to remember that one size never fits all, and perfection is impossible. The world in which we live is so complicated and the problems so entrenched that perfect adherence to any given set of rules, even if it were possible, may not visibly make a dent in the short term. But I think realizing from the get-go that none of us can do it perfectly is liberating, because it takes the weight of the world off our shoulders and can ramp up our motivation and enthusiasm for trying some bold new things in our tiny little circles of influence. And I find it useful here to think about how we approach every other big, bold life aspiration. I mean, we don't say, for instance, I don't always love my enemies, guess I'm not a Christian. Or sometimes I get angry, guess I'm not a Buddhist after all. Or I lost my cool with my child, forget parenting, done with that. I mean, in these cases, we don't just dump our aspirations when we fail. We forgive ourselves and go again, and we learn from our mistakes. So why say there's a leather belt around my waist, or a Milky Way wrapper in my car, or stroopwafels fell into my cart, guess I'm not a vegan? Each person is going to face unique patterns of imperfection and failure. What counts is that we find concrete practices that keep us striving toward the vision, notwithstanding our inevitable failures. Now, that's why Hungry Beautiful Animals avoids using the term veganism like the plague to describe this transformational vision of the world and the accompanying set of practices I hope to beautify. In my experience, isms often just aren't very inviting. I mean, even when they're inclusive, they're often still perceived as uncompromising and obligation based and identity focused. They're about who's in the club and who's out and why. No matter how friendly and welcoming vegans themselves may be, and in my experience, they're usually both, veganism seems to offer very little room to deviate from stringent expectations and value judgments that many find alienating, even when they're open to moving in a vegan direction. Going vegan, in positive contrast, is an experimental, aspirational activity that takes shape through practicing an evolving set of exercises. One can be at different places along the way of one's journey into going vegan, the beginning or the end, or a slump in the middle, or a renaissance brought on by a beautiful new cookbook or friend. But the adventure of going vegan lasts a lifetime. And this adventure is an action, not an identity. One cannot be a vegan in the sense of having mastered the practice or fully instantiated the ideal. One is always still going vegan, no matter how long one has been in the game. By embracing the language of going vegan rather than adopting veganism, I'm advocating an outlook on vegan living that is progressive and action-focused rather than perfectionistic and identity-based. I want to create a space for anyone who is even remotely intrigued by the vegan vision to adopt the aspiration of being on the way, even if their day-to-day practices still depart radically from the ideal. So just imagine the cultural awakening we could spark if going vegan came to be seen as the dazzling joy aggregator that it is. In going vegan, we stand inwardly to save ourselves physical inflammation, cognitive dissonance, emotional incoherence, and moral hypocrisy, and outwardly to save ourselves the huge amounts of land and water and grain and pharmaceuticals and pandemic risk and worker injustice and animal suffering we currently exploit to feed ourselves, freeing up vast energies with which to pursue more abundant and joyful ways of being for all earthlings. So whether one is a level 50 vegan that eats nothing that casts a shadow, or a person resolving to eat plant-based once a week, once a month as a first step, the important thing is that one is going vegan, moving in the direction of that beautiful vision through the practice of concrete disciplines that enable whatever approximation your circumstances currently tolerate. Eating, then, is not just potentially an act of justice, but one of deep joy. So let us strive each day to eat for the love of the world and for the flourishing of all creatures, that truth, beauty, and goodness may roll down like water and our joy may be full. Thanks so much for listening to the presentation. And now for the good part, I'm so looking forward to our conversation, Julia, and I will toggle out of this and unshare my screen. Good. I think we achieved it.
Thank you. Thanks so much. That was really beautiful. We'll have some time for conversation now. I want to remind folks, though, that at any time you can put in your questions, and we'll get to those as we can at the end. I wanted to ask a question about your starting point, and I appreciate how you said, this is not a work of academic philosophy, this is a narrative, creative nonfiction. But I do want to ask a philosophy question, maybe-ish. But so it's just really striking how consistently you talk about joy. Of course, that's not surprising, it's in the title. But it is really consistent. And because of that, you end up talking a lot in the book about other things that are related to joy, right? Desire, beauty, awe. You talk a lot about other emotional, intense reactions like disgust. I think there was more than one occasion that you narrate throwing up from disgust, or crying. You talk a lot about crying and being the kind of person who cries a lot, and we hear about some of the instances in which you're moved to tears. What would you say to someone who might say to you something like, I thought philosophy was supposed to be about reason and making reasonable arguments and not talking about emotions? You know, and then a side question, like, is joy an emotion? And if so, is it a reliable or appropriate thing around which to orient ethical decisions like eating?
Mm. Oh man, you've packaged two absolute whoppers, right? It sounds like one question, but it's really two. And I'll start with the first one about, what about this philosophical impetus always to provide the arguments? And actually, I can tell you, Julia, that the reason this book is more of an aesthetic argument than a moral one is because the philosophical space is just absolutely jam packed with philosophical arguments. With, right, here's the empirical facts of the matter, here's the moral principles. Now we churn it through consequentialism, or we churn it through deontology, or we churn it through capabilities theory, right? We take the facts, take the theory, and out comes veganism, right? And it's always veganism, and the leverage is always the argument. And I think what social science, as well as our lived experience, teaches us, for most of us, if arguments work at all, they kind of have a post hoc effect. Like most of us don't look at the arguments and change. Most of us have some emotional or spiritual experience and change. And then we go looking for justifications so that our family doesn't laugh us out of the room at Thanksgiving, or so that we can defend ourselves with that one professor, right, who, really hectors us about this commitment we have. So because the philosophical literature is sort of jammed with all these, I think, really impressive intellectual and moral reasons to go vegan, but because there was a lot less philosophical literature talking about the way the affective parts of who we are play in not only to our lived experience and into the way our agency and motivation works, but also beyond that, the way our very rationality works. Right? Because what a lot of people, fail to realize is that our reason is often tracking within this kind of aesthetic framework, right? And what I mean by that, this will come as no surprise to anyone who's doing Catholic theology of any kind, right? The hermeneutic situation, this idea that Augustine has that desire, right, is the beginning of understanding, right? So you're kind of seeing the deep Christian roots, maybe, of the project here. But the thought is that, our affective capacities have a lot to do with why and how we reason as we do in particular situations. So, for example, when somebody comes to you with this whiz bang argument that you should go vegan, and you compute on the spot that this would mean becoming a social exile, being an emotional wreck at all the holidays, physically being hungry all the time, wondering about how you're going to get your protein and et cetera, your head is sort of thinking, okay, this is an impressive argument, but all the other parts of your inner family are like, eh. So what does social science tell us happens to the mind in cases like that? Identity protective cognition goes up, and it doesn't matter how many facts, how many moral principles, how many arguments I have. Reasonably, I am going to prioritize the most important things to creatures like us: comfort, security, and approval from the gatekeepers in our community. And so I think, I gave you a complicated answer to a complicated question, but I think the threads are aesthetics often underlies, right? Are the framework in which we make reasonable claims and deal with the various claims made upon us. Also, our agency and our motivation are deeply affected by how we feel. And last, and probably first, is that usually we don't change our minds first. We change our hearts first, and then we go looking for reasons to drag the mind, often reluctantly, along.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great answer. I think I want to pull out another theme that I noticed, and I wonder if maybe it might be related. But this other thing that was really interesting to me that you do is I just want to track a few examples of this. you have this really optimistic view of human beings in the book, it seems like to me. In theology, we would call it optimistic anthropology. I don't know if you would say the same thing in philosophy, but um, and by that, it seems like you narrate like that we already know in our gut what is right. We're vegans in waiting, or a quote that I liked is that going vegan is about staying, quote, as close as you can to who you already are. And in some places, you talk about this kindergarten sense of ethics that and we just need to kind of tap into our kindergarten sense of ethics to notice that we are already aspiring vegans. I love that you use, I'm going to say one more example, right? You use this metaphor that we are searching for keys that we already have in our hands. I loved that. So I just wanted to first just check, like, do I have that right?
Yeah.
And then I wanted to ask you about this in a respectful way. Do you really believe that? Or is that like a strategic or rhetorical way to nudge us towards ethical behavior?
Yeah. So I think it's a both and. I mean, as a hermeneutic philosopher, it's never going to be an either or, right? It's always going to be a both and. And I want to, I want to sort of tweak, right, the optimism piece a little bit, because I guess what I would see it as is a kind of hopeful realism. So I'm not optimistic that we'll achieve any of this necessarily, but I think it makes sense in a world like ours to seek out, and this is, I think, a very Pauline idea, seek out the places where the fruits of the Spirit are clustered in abundance and build your life around the harvesting of those fruits, right? Now, nobody who's spent any time in a world like ours trying to harvest the fruits of the Spirit thinks they're just going to walk around every corner and pluck them from every institution, right? But what at least I've seen is that if you live a life where you do talents and gifts discernment to figure out what you love, and you take the Jesus picture, right, of what leads to a beautiful life, and you apply that, you can have incredible personal joy. And at the same time, you can be salt and light in a world that is a mess. Now, I'm not optimistic that being salt and light in a world that's a mess is going to transform the world overnight. But I do think it's probably the best chance we have, right? I mean, the metaphor that I often will use is each of us is working on our own little patch of a quilt, right? And I come from a Mennonite family, so we have these absolutely amazing quilts, right? Quilted together from all this 70s polyester that it's hard to imagine anyone volunteering to wear, but now, right, it's become a quilt. And I love this idea, right, where you work at this one little patch and then you spend your life using your talents and gifts to try to find the other 5 patches that are going to get stitched onto that one you're working on. And if each of us go out there with a kind of hopeful realism that probably the most we're going to do is get a nice patch of our own and maybe start stitching it into 2 or 3 of the other patches, right? And keeping with the opportunities that arise for us. If we're realistic about that standard, and we're cultivating joy in the way that the good book tells us to. Now, this book is not an explicitly Christian book, right? I mean, it's written for everybody, but I think anyone with the eyes to see, right, will see that there's a kind of Christian moral psychology at the least, right? That is underneath the book. And I would describe that less in terms of optimism than sort of hopeful realism, where it's going to be bad until it's not, but we can have joy nonetheless, and we can be salt and light nonetheless in ways that give us the best chance, both individually and collectively.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. And I love the image of the quilt because I was going to ask you about that to kind of flesh out a little bit more. I really love how pluralistic your book is intentionally. And also, you talk at the same time, you talk very clearly about that you have a Christian background, that you were raised Mennonite, that you teach at a Reformed Christian college. I mean, so, and just looking at some of the footnotes where you're citing some of your other work in other places, it's clear that you have done some of that work of thinking about these things from a Christian tradition specifically. So I'm glad to hear you kind of go there, because it's really interesting to us, particularly at the center, that also comes from a Christian background. And I wrote down a quote that you have from page 116, where it says, "The forces that shaped me can be reshaped. The world can change, and I can be a servant of its transformation." And I think about that image of the quilt, where it's these maybe discarded scraps that are transformed into a new and beautiful artistic creation with others, right? I mean, it's very hard to make a quilt on your own.
Yeah. And I really, that passage was one of those ones that came easy. Not all of the passages come easy,
Sure.
but that one did. And I think the sentence after it or somewhere nearby is, if only one classroom, one church basement, and one, right? So, yes, there's world transformation, but it happens in these tiny little places where we have our agency. It's not necessarily, it's not up to us, right, to do it all. And I think that's why the realism stays hopeful, right? Because I don't have to save the world. What I have to do is get to know myself, as Socrates says, discern what my talents and gifts are, and then find my vocation, right? In that rich, thick, in my tradition, Christian sense of the word, but most spiritual traditions have this idea that there's a cosmic calling out, that you, small, tiny, fallen, frail, finite little you, has an opportunity to engage this cosmically important work. However, your part of it is tiny, right? And I love all the metaphors, right, of the mustard seed that eventually gives shade, right, for the birds to shelter, right? I mean, these tiny little things we do are like yeast in the dough. And if we can content ourselves with our tiny littleness and just work with joy at the one or two things we're good at, taking this tiramisu to the potluck, having a hard conversation once a year with so-and-so, right? I mean, it does not have to be, this world changing on a grand scale thing, but the world can change inside in ways that then flow outward in great abundance to the world outside. And that's the thing that makes me so excited about going vegan, right? Because whereas veganism, right, sort of, you're always one step away from failing again and losing your vegan card, right, getting apprehended by the vegan police. But going vegan, right, you've got room to breathe. You can work at the things that your talents and gifts suit you for, and you can muddle in the areas that are still difficult. It's just like parenting or Christ following or any other sort of big, bold aspiration where we know in advance we can't get it all at one go, because that's just not in the cards for finite, error-prone creatures like us. Even with all our joy, we're still, this is the reformed part coming through, right? There's still going to be this deep-seated error that we're going to have to keep correcting for always and forever.
This reminds me of your last chapter. You use the image of the veil, the veil between my desires and everybody else's, the veil between desire and fulfillment, the veil between the small and the great, these little things that we can do, and this connection to the transcendent. I wonder if you could talk more about, you're already doing it a little bit, but what this veil is and what it looks like or feels like when this veil is at its thinnest.
Yeah. So, I mean, for every person, it's different. One of the key features of this book is that there's no one size fits all, right? And the whole last third of the book is devoted to trying to make it vivid for people how much this has to be tailored to the specific experiences, limitations, talents, and gifts of the people. And so when it comes to thinking about when the veil is thin, I mean, think about those times in your life where you see something and it's just so true that your ears start filling with blood, right? Or the song in the movie touches you at such a deep level that all the hair on your body stands up, right? There's just there's this way, right, where I mean, I love, oh gosh, of course, in The Clutch, I forget the poet's name. His work is all over the book, White, right? And he talks about beauty as the harvest of presence, right? And he says, beauty is what you experience when everything inside you from time immemorial is sort of pulled toward, right, this experience on the outside that you thought you'd never have. And for me, that's the thinning of the veil, right? When all these particular inner things that often tempt us to be selfish, that often drive us away from community, that often drive us toward vengeance rather than forgiveness, right? All these particularities that make us who we are, that are part and parcel of our finitude and fallenness, right? When all those things kind of fade into oblivion and you feel just this sense of awe and awesome, right? Awesome in the sense of being awed, connection to the all, right? And I love the way that going vegan thins that veil, right? So that your personal preferences, the kinds of things that make you say, well, look, I don't care what turkeys are like. I can't do a holiday without eating its dead body, right? I mean, when you look at it like that in a sort of clinical way, you see, well, there's an inside that's possessive of various things so that it can't resonate with what's outside, right? The turkey is food and only food. The only way that you can see the turkey is as enjoyment on the holiday. But when the veil is thin, you see creaturely flourishing that you both share, right? All of those inner selfish, sort of self-focused things are opened up by this realization that, holy smokes, the snood on that bird just went from crimson to white in 4 seconds. And that's because he's telling something to the members of his flock about his mood. And, you know, those kinds of experiences can really change our orientation, right? Because once you start living in these liminal spaces where the veil is thin, instead of seeing other creatures as tools, right, you start to see them as fellow creatures. And this is kind of how it goes with loving relationships too, right? Is like when you're really open to unconditional love, the selfishness has a way of kind of melting away, and there's space for risk. There's space for messiness. There's space, right? So that's what I have in mind by the thinning of the veil, right? It dissolves the barriers between what's going on inside and the beauty of the world at large and our membership as a part of that whole, right? Instead of our scarce fighting for what's ours, right? And so really it's about, you know, turning toward the thinning of the veil, living in ways that thin the veil is, as I talk about a lot in the book, right? Pivoting from scarcity to abundance, right? Pivoting from this kind of inner battle to get what you think you need to this kind of outer openness to the flourishing of everything.
Yeah. I thank you. That's really helpful. And I want to ask you more about the spiritual exercises that you talk about also in this later part of the book. And you would, I mean, if you didn't read the book, you might think, well, the exercises that you're going to be talking about would be, and I'm looking through my notes so I don't get this wrong, that the exercises would be, not eating animals and donating to sanctuaries and not wearing animals and things like that. But those are not actually the spiritual exercises. These are other things that maybe support those practices. But so I wonder if you might want to talk a little bit more about what these spiritual exercises are, and maybe what's spiritual about them.
Yeah. So we're all familiar as human beings with this idea that there are some things you've just got to do over and over and over and over again until they take, right? And that there are just some goals you can never meet by accident. It's only through habituating, right? Doing it again and again and again and again until certain dispositions are formed. And then you can start to make progress. And I think a lot of us know exactly what we mean by that when we're talking about goals like getting good at glass blowing or becoming a good soccer player or this sort of thing. But we're less practiced at thinking about exercises that help us to cultivate harmony among the different parts of who we are as human beings, right? And so when I talk about spiritual disciplines, I'm talking about those repetitive daily practices that go to work at harmonizing all these different parts of who we are. Right? I love the metaphor of the inner family, right? That the psychologist Richard Schwartz uses in the internal family systems model of thinking about therapeutic work. But what spiritual disciplines do is that they're repetitive daily practices that weave together these often conflicting and intention parts, our intellect, our emotions, our social engagements, our physical bodies, right? And what these exercises do is they help those parts to start working together as a whole so that something like joy, right, can be experienced. And what that joy is getting your inner parts working together so that the abundance generated by that inner familial work then can contribute to the whole. And I think that's right where the spiritual part comes in, because I think of spiritual as basically meaning a holistic unity of the physical, emotional, social, intellectual, and moral aspects, such that the harmony produced allows you to find, right, how your little flow works its way into the big flow, right? A little bit of a Taoist metaphor there, but there's some Christian mystics doing these sorts of things as well. And so, yeah, it's all about these repetitive daily practices that help us do that. And of course, I mean, I think not eating animal products can be a powerful spiritual exercise. But if you haven't gotten good at understanding the potential conflicts between your intellect, your social self, and your emotions, and you try to go to Thanksgiving with just, I'm not going to eat animal products, that's my spiritual exercise. Well, we all know that's going to fall flat in 10 minutes, right? What you need is repetitive daily practices like loving kindness meditation, right? Because you know that the minute you get there, your Uncle Keith is going to start needling you with, oh, look, I just went hunting, right? Check out this head of a giant moose, right? And what you're going to do, your emotional part and your social part are going to gang up on the intellectual part, and you're going to fly off the handle at Keith and all your plans, right? Or you're going to start self-medicating with chicken wings, or you're right. I mean, there's all these ways in which if you fail to get inner harmony going into a situation like that, the quote unquote, right, like vegan spiritual exercises can't get any traction, right? So the idea in that last third of the book is we've got to amend our inner soil. We've got to get all these different parts of who we are working together, because going vegan touches all those different aspects of who we are in profound ways simultaneously. And so if we don't get those parts of us aligned in ways that can work together when we're out there in the world, the odds of actually being able to eat fewer and fewer animal products, wear fewer and fewer animals, donate to more and more charities that are seeing things in this more holistic way, we're going to lose steam on those right quick if we don't have this inner alignment. And that's a set of exercises that anybody can do. And I think they support going vegan. And I think going vegan is also a really useful exercise in itself for doing that spiritual work. So I do think that going vegan is a powerful spiritual exercise unto itself for the way that it illuminates and knits these different parts of who we are together, right? So, but yeah, does that get at the question you're asking? Well, it was a little circuitous, but
yeah, that's great. I wonder if I can pivot a little bit and ask you some questions directly about food. I love how you included all of the pictures of beautiful and exciting sounding dishes. So I'm curious if I could put you on the spot and ask you to tell us a story about a meal that you've had in recent memory where you experienced something of this deep harmony between aspiring you and belonging you.
yeah.
You've had lots of these experiences, but maybe just tell us one in recent memory, like what did you eat? Who did you eat with?
Yes. Oh my goodness. So this was really exciting. And it was just a couple of weeks ago. I had a professional conference in Washington, D.C. And whenever I travel to do something to try to sort of get as much bang for the carbon footprint as I possibly can, I'll reach out to see if there are activists on the ground or other organizations that want to do something. And an Instagram influencer, I'm too old to know what this means, but somebody who makes these really cool videos of her making food and her doing advocacy in DC and with her friends and her community. She invited me to do kind of an interview and some readings in this yoga studio, so we were all sitting right on these pillows, and the yoga studio was right above this absolutely incredible vegan institution in Washington, D.C. It's called DC Vegan. And the whole point of this restaurant, its owner, John, was all about helping people see there are no aesthetic sacrifices that anyone needs to make. This is just total and complete comforting abundance. And so they have all these dishes, the ones that you crave from the family restaurant you grew up going to, right? Chicken piccata, and there's which is made out of seitan. And then they had this amazing dish. I used to just absolutely love calamari, and they had a trumpet mushroom calamari that was one of the best things I've ever tasted, in this glorious red sauce that was clearly somebody's grandmother's recipe. I mean, this thing did not come out of a jar. It was incredible. And so after this amazing, right, people had come from all over, and they were boots on the ground people like I was 20 years ago, right, when I first got going in these things. And so it was invigorating to be with younger people, many of whom are suffering from the compassion fatigue that drove me to write Hungry, Beautiful Animals, to try to make this pivot from scarcity and sadness and the obligation to prevent suffering to something more abundant and joyful. So it was super fulfilling. And they had tiramisu. And so tiramisu is one of my favorite things. And as I mentioned in the book, like, I couldn't live without it. I certainly couldn't go vegan without it. And so one of my first 3 little projects, I talk about when you first start going vegan, to have these like tiny, simple little wishes, like just tiny little things that you try to do. And one of mine was to teach a class, and one of mine was to go vegan for a couple of weeks for the duration of that class, see what it went like. And then the third thing was find a tiramisu that would involve zero compromises, right? And so it just felt so full circle.
Hmm.
Here it was 20 years later, and I'm with these people 20 years younger, and I am at my full power from the standpoint of what I have to share. You know, I've never felt more confident. I've never felt more excited. I wasn't nervous. I was just completely present. And then this food. And I just had this feeling, right, that like the world could be like this. Right? I am giving up nothing here. And there's all sorts of people in this restaurant, and we're all eating too much sodium, and we don't give a damn because it's delicious. And so that was an experience of really feeling um, abundant and fulfilled in the company of like-minded people who are at that early stage of their career where they really need some latitude to mess up, some latitude to look at the abundance rather than always focusing on the suffering. It was amazing. Thank you for this question. It
Yeah.
generated a lot of enthusiasm to relive it.
And then, of course, as you mentioned earlier, you include your own tiramisu recipe in the very back. But I do have to ask you this one question, and this will be the last one. So, tiramisu really does feel like a really important thing in your life. But if you had the space for one or two more recipes in the book, what would you have included?
Oh man, so I absolutely loved barbecue ribs. I mean, and we are making enormous headway now in the alt protein movement, which is not the vegan movement, right? The alt protein movement is more about how do we give meat eaters what they want without destroying the planet, right? Kind of a different set of issues. But oh man, I mean, the things you can do now with plants or with cells. But I make just a plant-based, like a gluten-based version. Definitely not, unfortunately, for celiacs. I have to find right another way to do this without gluten. So for my friends with sensitivity, my apologies. But for those who can eat gluten, I showed a picture of them. It was the one where there was wine and beer at the same place setting. Yeah, this is a celebration food for sure. So those seitan ribs. And there's actually a story in the book about my love affair with ribs. That actually was a big part of my turning toward a more abundant way of thinking about things, sort of a story around loving to eat ribs. And then what else? This is kind of a crazy thing to say because it's super simple, but I love smoothies. And like one of my favorite possessions on earth is a Vitamix, which is like this power blender. And I mean, you can put nuts in this thing with a little bit of water and like turn it into whipped cream, like stiff peaks. This blender is just insane. And I love to make smoothies. And I think one of my favorite smoothies right now, because it's just so shocking how delicious it is, like based on how easy it is. So basically, you put equal parts pineapple, grapes, spinach, and ice in a blender, right? And that sounds like it would be not so great, but it is amazing. And it's something that we all love in my house. And so my Vitamix is kicking up. When the kids were little, we used to call it, for some reason, a bow on the go smoothie. I don't even know why, but there was a character that was maybe that color, or I don't know, something. But it's this bright electric green, and it has this like pineapple foam on the top. And it's super easy, but it's super delicious. And then one more bonus recipe, a chocolate mousse that only has 4 ingredients. And this can be made in the Vitamix as well. So it's the shelf-stable silken tofu. So like the tofu that comes in the little box. And then chocolate chips. So like a dark chocolate chips, vanilla, and soy milk. That's it. And you get that thing wicked smooth. You put it into ramekins, and it is heaven on earth. chocolate mousse from 4 ingredients. So there's 4 recipes.
That's awesome.
Too many of them are dessert. The dessert to main ratio is out of whack here, but oh well.
Well, you prepped us at the very beginning of the program. So. Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful conversation. And now I feel hungry. So I'm going to, so I really appreciate you being with us tonight. I want to say, I just want to put into the chat, we have lots of events at the Center for the Study of Spirituality that are coming up, including our next event is the Thomas Merton Lecture in Spirituality, given by Ronald Rollheiser on November 11th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We're actually hosting that in person and live stream. So if you are in the Northern Indiana area, join us in person. You don't need a ticket. You can just show up in Carroll Auditorium, or if you're at a distance, you can tune in live stream for free in the same way that you registered for this event. So thank you again, Professor Halteman. What a wonderful and joyful conversation. Thank you for being with us.
It's a thrill to be with you. And I can also say to remaining participants, if anyone wants to do an event like this or, a book group or things like this, I have a grant that allows me to spend about 1/3 of my time doing work with anybody who'd like to do some. So don't be shy. Please feel free to, send me an email. Let me know how I can help with the work that you're doing. And I'd love to be in touch with people who are interested and looking for free programming.
What's the best way for folks to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think my email address, my business email at Calvin University, it's M as in Matt, C as in cat, H as in hat, 7 as in days of the week at calvin.edu.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much.